Hi Yr9, welcome along. This video for you and your lesson here on Wednesday. You might be glad to see that I am not on the screen this time. I wanted to save as much space as I could for actually seeing what's going on. You're going to need to be ready to pause this lesson. There's quite a bit going on here and I'm trying to squeeze this all into a 15-minute video while I also want to read through an article with you, which you'll also find on Show My Homework as well. So the first thing here is task number 1, and if you could please leave space for your title on your work, but then write task 1 so I can clearly see which tasks are which in your work. Task 1 then is a prediction task using some of those Viper's Cave skills, those core English skills, and prediction is one of them. So I want you to have a look at these, which I'm about to reveal here. Look at these. You won't necessarily know who they are, I'll tell you in a minute, but what do you think all of these people have in common is your first sentence. If it's like a guess, it's a prediction. Why might they have had statues made of them? And it's not because they did exactly the same thing. And the second thing is, why might there be statues of them then? So the two questions sort of link. But if you could have a go at a sentence then, make a prediction. And now pause this video right now, and I will go quiet for a few seconds to allow you to pause. Okay, so I'd be interested to read your answers. I'm not necessarily going to go through any particular answer. Ones I do know, certainly, the two either side, on the left and the right, are involved in the slave trade. The guy in the middle is Winston Churchill from the Second World War, British Prime Minister, and the female is Florence Nightingale, famously a nurse during the Crimean War in the 1850s, did a lot of good work. So, the title then is at the top of the screen there. Black Lives Matter protests. This is a lesson which I've designed very deliberately for you, which really links in with the very, very current issues that are all happening. I just need to fill people in case they don't know and what's happened. So in America, I'm just going to read bits of what's on the screen on the right hand side there. The US has been convulsed, like disgusted, by nationwide protest over the death of an African American man held in police custody. So George Floyd, 46, died after being arrested by police. It should be pointed out they were white police outside a shop in Minneapolis in Minnesota. Footage of the arrest on the 25th shows a white police officer kneeling on Mr. Floyd's neck while he was pinned to the floor. Mr. Chauvin, who is the police officer, has been charged with murder. The key events that led to Mr. Floyd's death happened just 30 minutes beforehand. That is the extract from a BBC News article. It does go on longer, but the thing is, this police officer was arresting George Floyd, who you see on the screen there, but he was pinning him to the ground as well with his knee on his neck. And George Floyd was heard saying, "I can't breathe." And the police officer didn't stop. And I think he held him there for 9 minutes. He did then die. They called an ambulance. They weren't able to resuscitate him and he died. He was meant to be arrested over some sort of counterfeit money he'd been spending in a shop or something. There's a lot of going around it, but essentially, this death of this man has sparked enormous protests all around the world, starting with America, but then moving on more widely. And I wanted to use that as a sort of focus for this lesson, really, with you. So these are some of the protests, some pictures of protests that have been happening here in the UK over the last few days. Over the weekend, it was particularly these strong protests. The top left picture is Parliament Square. That scaffolding is around Big Ben, to give you some idea where it is in London. Huge protests, as are the ones on the right. That's also London. They did turn violent in places. Not all of the protesters were violent. In fact, a vast majority weren't. But yes, some of the police have been injured in these protests as well by some protesters turning violent. And the statue in the bottom right is one I'm going to come on to a little bit more in case you hadn't seen that at all in the news. But that is a protester kneeling on that statue's neck, sort of copying what was done to George Floyd in the US. And it really is sparking around the idea that too many black people are being mistreated. Many have died in police custody in America. This is much more so than Britain, although it's not completely clear in Britain and clean. But nevertheless, I'd like to explain your thoughts to this statement. So you're going to need to pause this video in a second. All protests must be peaceful. There should be no violence and no strong actions and vandalism or anything like that in protests. I'd look for 2 or 3 sentences, please, because it's your thought, and then explaining why you think that is important. So pause this video now, and I'm going to go quiet for a few seconds. Okay, and I'm presuming you've done that. So that is something I look forward to seeing in your work. Your thoughts on that? And now what we're going to do is read this article, which I've screen grabbed there on the right. Edward Colston statue been torn down because he was a slave trader. and there was a statue of him in Bristol. But let's read that article more, because my next task for you will be answering those questions. So just bear with me a moment as I flick that one up. So I'm going to read this quite quickly because I haven't got a huge amount of time. So I've read you the title already. This was Sunday. During a slave trader's statue in Bristol has been torn down and thrown into the harbour during a second day of anti-racism protests across the UK. It comes after largely peaceful demonstrations across the weekend saw some clashes with police. On Sunday evening, police in central London issued a dispersal order for the city of Westminster, compelling people to leave the area after skirmishes. Boris Johnson tweeted that the protests had been subverted by thuggery. Like, subverted means like undertaken, like people have almost grabbed hold of them by thugs. Thousands of protesters massed for their second day in London, as well as cities across the UK, including Bristol, Manchester, Wolverhampton, Nottingham, Glasgow and Edinburgh. Protests were generally peaceful, with aerial footage showing thousands of demonstrators flooding the roads outside the US Embassy in Vauxhall. That's like basically a building owned by the United States, but part of their government, in South London, before marching towards Parliament Square and Downing Street. But there were some disturbances, leading to 12 arrests in London, the majority for public order offences and 1 for criminal damage. 8 officers were injured, police said. Around 8 o'clock BST, bottles were thrown at police and there were clashes near Parliament. The crowd shouted "No justice, no peace" as they moved down Whitehall and let off smoke bombs. The Prime Minister later tweeted, "People have the right to protest peacefully and while observing social distancing, but they have no right to attack the police. These demonstrations have been subverted by thuggery and they are a betrayal of the cause they purport to serve. Those responsible will be held to account." Now this is the bit you're really going to focus on, because my questions are on this bit. Earlier in the day in Bristol, protesters used ropes to pull down the bronze statue of Edward Colston, a prominent 17th century slave trader who had been a source of controversy in the city for many years. Colston was a member of the Royal African Company, which transported about 80,000 men, women and children from Africa to the Americas. So just to be really clear, he worked for and was sort of a member of the company, and they took ships over to Africa, quite literally abducted and kidnapped people, sailed over to America and then sold them to be used as slaves. And I know some of you will have studied that in history. On his death, this is Colston, on his death in 1721, he bequeathed his wealth to charities, which means he left his wealth to charities, and his legacy can still be seen on Bristol streets, memorials and buildings, because there's buildings and streets named after him. After the statue was toppled, a protester was pictured with his knee on the figure's neck, which you saw in my lesson earlier, reminiscent of the video showing how George Floyd, the black man who died while being restrained by a Minnesota police officer. The statue was later dragged through the streets of Bristol and thrown into the harbour. The empty plinth was used as a makeshift stage for protesters. Remember, a plinth is like what a statue stands on, so the protesters then used that. Home Secretary. Now this is the lady who's in charge of sort of safety, police and things like that in our country. Priti Patel called the tearing down of the statue utterly disgraceful, adding that it speaks to the acts of public disorder that have become a distraction from the cause people are protesting about. It's right that police follow up and make sure that justice is undertaken with those individuals that are responsible for such disorderly and lawless behaviour, she said. In a statement, Avon and Somerset Police, so that's the local police to Bristol, confirmed there would be an investigation into the act of criminal damage. Historian Professor David Olusoga told BBC News that the statue should have been taken down long before. He said statues are about saying, "This was a great man who did great things." That is not true. He, talking about Colston, was a slave trader and a murderer. In a statement, the Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees, said that he knew the removal of the statue would divide opinion, but it was important to listen to those who found the statue to represent an affront to humanity. So there you go. The article which I'm going to ask you questions about, I've tried to give you little hints about things you may not have been completely clear on, but the thing we're going to really focus in is the Bristol one where this statue was torn down. So if I just nip back onto this again quickly, and pause this slide. I'm going to go quiet in a minute, but these are the questions I would like you to answer. Number 1 and number 2 are quick retrieval, so find the information. 3 is putting the article into your own words, and I've given you a hint there in brackets. 4 asks you to look up some of those words. 5 is an inference question, which is going to require you to sort of think and use the ideas to try and make an educated, work it out guess. Empathise, so number 6 is like putting yourself into the shoes. And 7, explaining your feelings about protesters. And that number 7, I'm really looking for a longer answer, please. What I'm going to do here, in fact, is give you your secret word and give you the picture I'd like you to draw, please. The picture I'd like to do is try and draw me a statue of something. Make sure it's like got a plinth or something. You could draw the Statue of Liberty, for example, from New York, but draw me some sort of statue. And let's go for a word. Let's go for the word icon and write down what that word means. So that's your extra little task that I'll be looking for. You can do all this at the top of your work. Draw a statue, write the word icon, I-C-O-N, and then write me the meaning of the word icon so I know you've watched this video properly. I'm going to go quiet for a few seconds to let you pause this screen. Remember that this is also uploaded on Show My Homework. I'm going quiet now. Okay, that should be enough time, because that is task 4. If you haven't done so, I might not have reminded you there. Write task 4 next to those questions so I can see really clearly. You should have had a go at all of those. Even if you struggle, I think you should be able to have a real... You should definitely be able to have had a go at all of those questions. Finally, task 4 is explaining your thoughts about these 2 questions I've put here, and they link to what you see on the screen below, which I'll explain in a second. The 2 questions at the top there are, should we start removing statues of people who have dark pasts? A bit like Edward Colston then, the one who was ripped down because he had links to the slave trade. Should we take down statues of anyone who's got a dodgy past, which we don't like, they've done bad things? And then also, who gets to decide which statues may be removed? That's not a literal question. I would like you to decide. Who do you think has the power to decide? Does it be the government? Do you trust them to make those decisions? Should it be people who are able to rip down any statue they don't like? Or if not, how and who? So those are the 2 questions. I'm definitely looking for a couple of sentences for the first one, probably 3 really, and then 1 definitely for the second one. Just to give you some context as well, in Plymouth, I just read a minute ago that Plymouth are going to be removing or changing the name of a couple of streets who have been named after people who have got links to the slave trade. But also Sir Francis, is it Francis Drake? No, Walter Raleigh. I think it's Sir Walter Raleigh who's linked with Plymouth. There's a big statue of him in a really famous location in Plymouth. And the question is whether they take those statues down. The thing I'd like to put into your heads with this question as well, if you just remove all of these statues of anyone who's done anything bad, are we then ignoring our past and not learning from it? Because some people are making the point that maybe we should put plaques with these statues, like really obvious prominent plaques, so people can read and actually find out the full history of these people. We celebrate them because they did this, however you should also be aware that they did this in their past as well. The Churchill statue there, which is in Parliament Square right next to Big Ben, was graffitied, as you can see, over the weekend with the what you see there, the tag was a racist. And there's some truth to Winston Churchill having not necessarily being a racist. It's not that simple, but he has some links to our colonial past when we were ruling over India in a very cruel way. You could look that up yourself and find out more information, but do we therefore not celebrate people like Winston Churchill because they have done some bad things, although they have also done amazing things? And that's why there's no easy answer to this. It's not black or white, which is sort of an unfortunate use of phrase there, but it's got a grey area in the middle that we have to decide. So that's your 4th and final task. Make sure you put task 4 there for me as well. I look forward to having a look through your work. I'm going to try and put together a lesson to do with racism and trying to find a link to an unseen poetry, because remember, this is all to do with unseen poetry, developing those skills that you need for GCSE, but it's all about protests, and this just seemed like a really good opportunity to have a look at something very current in the news. If you didn't know about George Floyd before this lesson, I hope you found something out now, and if you do think you know something, look into that article anyway and just make sure you have all the facts, because sometimes you only get bits of it when you trust things that you hear on social media. So make sure you're fully educated and sort of have all the facts at your disposal. Year 9, thank you very much for watching this video all the way through. I hope you're all well. There's still talk of virtual lessons coming up, and I'm probably going to be involved in that, but we just need to work out how the best way of doing that safely is. So until I do some sort of virtual lesson in the future, I shall sign off this YouTube video and say thank you very much and goodbye.